Well, I am so glad that you've tuned in for today's virtual worship service and that you're here for part 2 in our new sermon series with the long title, Living as a Lamb in a World Full of Elephants and Donkeys. My name's Brock, and if this is your first time with us, you can probably guess from that series title that we're talking about faith and politics at the same time. And you'd be right to assume that that's a risky combination. In fact, I addressed some of that last week in the introduction to the series. I talked about how this series is particularly treacherous because everyone comes to the table with strong opinions already formed about what's right and what's wrong, about what's important and what's the best way to engage politics as a person of faith. Consequently, I think it's likely that during this series, I'm going to disappoint nearly everyone in the audience because the conclusions I'm going to share might not match up perfectly with the conclusions that you've arrived at already. You may find yourself wishing that I'd speak more specifically about a particular political issue that's important to you. You might feel like I'm meddling in areas that I should leave well enough alone. I may say something you disagree with entirely, but I'll assure you of a few things. If you identify politically as an elephant, then I'm not going to try to turn you into a donkey. And if you think of yourself as a political donkey, I'm not going to try to talk you into being an elephant either. But I'm convinced that Jesus calls us to a third way, a different strategy for engaging politics and a different model for inhabiting the planet together. I believe the church has something uniquely restorative to offer to a fractured culture, and I'm convinced that we can disagree on political issues without treating one another poorly. So with all that in mind, I want to remind you of my highly ambitious goal for this series that I announced last week. The goal is that, with God's help, on Sunday, November 8th, the Sunday following Election Day, no matter how the election goes, you will be able to be at peace in your own heart, but especially with your fellow believers. Now, today I want to talk a bit about the nature of politics and talk about why it tends to divide us so much. And then we're going to consider one of the ways that Jesus modeled and prescribed political engagement for us. And I want to start by taking a look just at the simple word politics. You see, it's important to know that while the mention of the word politics might raise some people's blood pressure, politics is not really a dirty word. Politics comes from an ancient Greek word that referred to the affairs of the city or the affairs of the citizens. And that means politics is all about how we organize our shared life together. It's not about offices and elections, debates and arguments, though that becomes part of it. Politics is about how we work together to achieve a common good. And the effects of politics are all around us. For example, today, while you're watching this broadcast, you're utilizing a connection to the internet that was made possible by lots of political decision-making about things like broadband spectrum allocations and utility rights-of-way and regulations that are incredibly complicated. And the device that you're using to watch this broadcast, it was likely designed and constructed using parts and ideas from multiple countries all over the world. And then that device was subject to taxes and tariffs, and it was transported by ships and planes or trains and trucks before it became yours. And all of those systems were established through politics or political decision-making to help achieve common goals. So politics is about the processes that we use to make decisions that affect all of us. And our day-to-day lives are influenced by thousands upon thousands of political decisions that have already been made. It's the rules and the choices and the restrictions and the entitlements that we agree to live with. And it's the system of enforcement and correction that gives those rules their authority. So politics isn't a bad thing. In fact, politics is good and necessary for us to live together in a cooperative society. Politics is a gift that we have. And the gift that we have is to the capacity to work together on a macro level and a micro level. But politics is complicated. And everybody doesn't get to be involved in every decision. So there are some big questions that have to be answered. Questions like, who gets the power to make decisions, and how are the people with the power influenced in their decision making? There are questions like, how much control do the decision makers have over everyone else, or how is the system structured? And these big questions, they're more and more difficult to agree about when there are more and more people involved, people with different backgrounds and circumstances and perspectives who are trying to agree. And that's what leads to the conflict that we so often associate with politics. So the questions about who's in charge and about how they're going to lead us and what we're going to empower them to do, those questions create a tension in society that's always being navigated and managed as we try to move forward. And the totally predictable thing that happens is when we gravitate toward people who answer the big questions the same way we do. It's totally natural to be drawn to the people who share your vision and your preferences and your ideas about what should happen. And the next natural development is for those who share the same vision to work together to make their shared vision of a reality. But unfortunately, that banding together too often results in seeing the world through a lens of us versus them. Good versus bad, right versus wrong. Now, as hard as it may be to imagine, Jesus' life on earth was situated in a time and a place that was arguably even more politically complicated and divided than the situation that you and I face today. And yet, Jesus clearly never saw himself being against anybody. In fact, all the way to his dying breath, it's clear that Jesus was for everybody. It's difficult for us to imagine the society where Jesus grew up. We're talking about 2,000 years ago in a much more primitive culture. Jesus grew up in Judea, which was an occupied territory of the Roman Empire. It was a region that had been dominated by one invading army after another for hundreds of years. And the people of Judea in Jesus' day knew nothing of political independence. They were taxed heavily, they were forced to pay tribute, and they were forced to live under the oppressive rule of regional governors who answered to Caesar himself, the emperor of Rome. And Roman occupation, it was the monumental problem facing the Jewish people. And the entire nation of Judea, they all dreamed of a day when they would be free from Roman rule. But as you can imagine, there was a wide array of opinions among the Jews about how they would go about achieving that independence. In fact, it's fair to say that the response to Roman occupation was the most significant source of political division among the Jewish people. There were political movements among the Jews that opted to work with the Romans, who maneuvered themselves for power and influence in whatever ways they could get in good with the governors. And they formed alliances with the political powers that were in place. They tried to do what they could to gain power by cooperating with their oppressors. Then there were other parties that favored passive resistance to the rule of the Romans. And so they did their best to only interact with the Romans when it was required. And they prayed that God would deliver them by sending a political leader that could overthrow the Roman Empire. But there were also factions among the Jews who were thirsty for a revolution. So they looked for ways to subvert the Roman authorities, and they staged violent rebellions from time to time. Nobody in Judea wanted the Romans to be in charge, but everyone had a different response and a different philosophy for how the nation should move forward. And Jesus, he just didn't fit the mold. When people tried to pin him down on political issues, he redirected their questions. When his neighbors pegged him as a revolutionary and tried to make him king, he slipped away and skipped town. He associated with people of every political persuasion and included polar opposite political personalities in his close group of followers. In fact, as Jesus built a following, he not only resisted reaching for power himself time and time again, but he criticized those who were using their power for their own purposes. Jesus just didn't fit in any of the political compartments that people tried to put him in. And as a result, the Jewish religious leaders, they had a problem with Jesus. He was becoming too popular with the crowds, and he was not only questioning their authority, but he was weakening their influence. And so the religious leaders were looking for a way to trap Jesus, which is what brings us to our text today. It's in the New Testament book of Luke, and we're in chapter 20. And there's a story here about a moment when some powerful Jewish leaders were trying to set Jesus up. They wanted to do one of two things. They wanted to either get him in big trouble with the Romans or force him to lose his influence among the Jews. They really didn't care which, as long as one way or another he got into some trouble. Here's how it went down. Beginning in chapter 20 and verse 20, Luke tells us that these Jewish leaders sent spies to infiltrate a crowd where Jesus was speaking. It says, watching for their opportunity, the leaders sent these spies that pretended to be honest men. And they tried to get Jesus to say something that could be reported to the Roman governor so that he would arrest Jesus. And they started like this. The spies said, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and you're not influenced by what others think. You teach the way of God truthfully. Now tell us, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, they tried really hard to sound sincere. You can almost imagine them practicing their lines beforehand to make it sound like they were genuinely curious about Jesus' teaching. But after they flattered Jesus with their compliments, the question they asked him was a provocative one, and they wanted to get his answer on the record, in public. This question would have been divisive among Jesus' most devoted disciples at the time, but this question was about a community's response to oppression. Israel was occupied by Rome. This was not an amicable relationship. Israel was not one of the United States of Rome. It was one of the captive territories. And so if Jesus answered yes, that it was right to pay taxes to Caesar, he'd sound like a Roman sympathizer, siding with the oppressors, and he would sound like a traitor to his own people. But if he answered no, that they shouldn't pay their Roman taxes, then he'd be labeled an insurrectionist, and he'd probably get in trouble with the authorities, and the governor would have reason to arrest him. Either way, the Jewish leaders figured that they would be free of their problem. But Luke tells us in verse 23 that Jesus saw through their trickery and said to them, "Show me a Roman coin whose picture and title are stamped on it." And they replied, "Caesar's." So someone in the crowd reached in their pocket and produced a Roman denarius, a coin that also had a picture of Caesar with an inscription that said, "Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus." You see, even the coin was provocative because it claimed that Tiberius Caesar's father was a god, which would make Caesar Tiberius the son of a god. So when the spies asked Jesus for an answer about taxes, they were trying to get him to take sides. "Jesus, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And here's what Jesus said, verse 25. "Well then, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." And when Jesus said that, his answer not only kept him out of hot water, it gave his listeners and those like us who would read about this 2,000 years later something profound to consider. Because even though Jesus redirected the question of taxes, he was making a political statement. He didn't reject the government's right to exist or create an unnecessary problem with the Romans for himself, but he did remind the Jews of who they were supposed to be. You see, while they were wondering what to do with a coin that bore Caesar's image, they were also remembering what they'd been taught their whole lives, that the human soul bears God's image. And so Jesus says, Caesar can have his coins, But in the process of giving that answer, he also asked the bigger question. Are we giving to God that which bears God's image? Everybody in Jesus' orbit was expecting him to form an earthly political movement. People were looking to Jesus to create a platform and build a following of people, and then to rescue Israel physically from their political enemies. Even the people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah God had promised thought that's what his mission was all about. And everyone who looked to him for a political movement was convinced that their political persuasion was the one that God would choose as well. Now, as a Christian, the political beliefs you hold and the way you act as a citizen, I know those are impacted by your faith. And as such, it would be almost impossible to consider or to believe that the side you're on wouldn't also be the side God's on. But Jesus was pursuing a higher purpose. Jesus' mission wasn't about choosing sides and creating division over the political disputes of his day. And I know that as a believer and as someone who desperately wants to serve God and live a life that reflects God, it can be so easy to see a direct connection between the political party you ascribe to and the God that you love wholeheartedly and insist that there could be no other way they go together. But Jesus' work transcended his national politics. He brought together the extremist Simon the Zealot on one hand and the conservative Roman sympathizer Matthew the tax collector around the same table. He made them both his disciples, and he created unity. He didn't pick sides between them. He didn't call one out as superior. He built a bridge between them, and he called them both to something higher. And so, church, this may be one of those moments I talked about where that feeling of disappointment may kick in for you during this series, but it's so important for us to acknowledge that no political party has cornered the market on Jesus. You can be an elephant and a Christian, but you can also be a donkey and a Christian. No political party can claim to exclusively have the mind of Jesus, because Jesus refused to be compartmentalized like that. And so, as we build up to what will surely be a volatile election season over the next few weeks, here's what I believe God's asking us to do. Whether you would describe yourself as an elephant or a donkey politically, when you look across the aisle and you see someone who believes so much differently than you do, you must remember that you're looking at someone who bears the image of God. Jesus lived in an extremely polarizing time, but his relationships were always more important than his politics. He had the ability to navigate difficult conversations while showing respect for the image of God in each person and always bringing this conversation back to what was most important, which was unity in glorifying God. And so for us, that looks like refusing to fight with someone that we don't have a relationship with. Think about it. If you don't know someone well enough to sit down and have a conversation over these important topics over coffee, you don't know them well enough to fight with them either. So we should be the people who stop stoking fires of division. For us, imitating Jesus in this area looks like refusing to let name-calling and insults leave our lips or our fingertips as we're sharing the message online. Jesus said, if you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. For us, living as lambs, living as imitators of the Lamb of God, means that we refuse to villainize those who see the world differently than we do. Instead, following Jesus' example, We are the people who reach across political differences and recognize the dignity, the value, the intelligence, and the contribution of those on the other side of the aisle. I hope that during this political season, that the reputation that we build and the reputation that we share, not only for ourselves, but for the church and for the God we serve, would be a reputation that is not interested in lifting up differences, but in sharing commonality, in finding a common path toward a good future together, and in being the kind of people who see the image of God in every person around us, whether we agree or disagree. And so that'll be my prayer for you today. Father, I thank you that you have implanted us into a world that is so full of conflict that we have an opportunity to demonstrate how to interact and to participate in politics in a different way. Father, it's so easy for us to be distracted. It's so easy for us to feel like the issues that are at stake are worth breaking relationship. But Father, as we look at the example of Jesus, we see that he constantly prioritized the work of the kingdom over temporary political issues in his day. May we live that same story by Jesus' example and by Jesus' power and in Jesus' name. And amen. May God bless you. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here next weekend.